Prince Alexander stood at the tall windows of Rosewood Palace, watching the autumn rain streak down the glass. His reflection showed a man who had aged beyond his 35 years, the weight of royal duty etched in the lines around his eyes. The golden crown that would one day be his felt heavier with each passing day, especially now that he had discovered the truth about his father's marriage. It had been 3 weeks since Alexander accidentally overheard the heated argument between King Edmund and Queen Isabella in the private study. The words still echoed in his mind like thunder that wouldn't fade. His father, the man the kingdom looked up to as a symbol of strength and honor, had been living a lie for over a decade. The marriage between King Edmund and Queen Isabella had been arranged when Alexander was barely 20. At the time, it seemed like a fairy tale. Isabella, a duchess from the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria, was beautiful, intelligent, and beloved by the people. She had brought peace between two nations that had been at odds for generations. The wedding was celebrated across both kingdoms, and Alexander had genuinely believed his father had found happiness after the tragic death of his first wife, Alexander's mother. But the conversation he had overheard painted a very different picture. King Edmund's voice had been strained with years of suppressed emotion as he spoke about feeling trapped in a marriage that had become more political theater than partnership. Isabella's response had been equally revealing, her usually gentle voice sharp with frustration as she spoke about the loneliness of being married to a man who could never truly love her the way she deserved. Alexander had learned that their public displays of affection were carefully orchestrated performances. Every state dinner, every public appearance, every photograph showing them as the perfect royal couple was an elaborate act. Behind closed doors, they lived almost separate lives, maintaining their marriage only for the stability of the kingdom and to preserve the peace treaty that depended on their union. The revelation had shaken Alexander to his core. His entire understanding of love, marriage, and duty had been built around what he believed was his father's successful second marriage. He had often sought his father's advice about relationships, admiring what he thought was Edmund's ability to find love again after loss. Now he wondered if everything he believed about royal responsibility and personal happiness was wrong. The weight of this knowledge was made heavier by the fact that Alexander couldn't share it with anyone. His younger sister, Princess Catherine, was getting married in 6 months to a duke from another kingdom. She had specifically chosen her fiancé because she admired their parents' marriage and wanted something similar. How could Alexander tell her that the foundation of her romantic ideals was built on deception? His own relationship with Lady Margaret Thornfield had been progressing toward marriage. She was everything the kingdom would expect in a future queen: intelligent, charitable, well-educated, and from a respected noble family. But Alexander found himself questioning whether their relationship was genuine love or simply another arrangement disguised as romance. Were his feelings real, or was he following the same path of duty-bound marriage that had trapped his father? The palace corridors that had once felt like home now seemed like a maze of secrets and obligations. Alexander walked through them differently now, noticing things he had overlooked before. The way his father's shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching. How Isabella's smile never quite reached her eyes during private family moments. The careful distance they maintained from each other even when they appeared close in public. The servants, who had worked in the palace for decades, treated the arrangement as an open secret. Alexander began to understand their meaningful glances and careful silence. They had been protecting a lie that the entire kingdom depended on. The peace treaty with Valdoria, the trade agreements, the stability that had brought prosperity to both nations, all of it rested on the illusion of a happy royal marriage. Alexander's daily routines became torture. Every morning meeting with his father felt like a performance where both men pretended Alexander didn't know the truth. Every public appearance where he stood beside his parents as they played their roles made him complicit in the deception. The weight of carrying this secret was affecting his sleep, his appetite, and his ability to focus on his royal duties. The most difficult part was watching his father suffer in silence. King Edmund had always been Alexander's hero, a man who had ruled with wisdom and strength through difficult times. Seeing him trapped in a loveless marriage, performing happiness for the sake of the kingdom, revealed a tragic side of royal life that Alexander had never considered. He began to understand that the crown his father wore was not just a symbol of power, but a chain of obligations that extended into every aspect of personal life. The king could not simply divorce and remarry for love because the consequences would ripple through international relations, potentially destabilizing two kingdoms and affecting millions of lives. Isabella, too, was a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She had married King Edmund in good faith, hoping to build a life and, perhaps, find love with time. Instead, she had become a prisoner of protocol, forced to smile and wave while feeling emotionally abandoned in her own marriage. Alexander saw how she threw herself into charitable work and public service, perhaps trying to find meaning and fulfillment outside of her failed personal relationship. The young prince found himself torn between his love for his father, his respect for Isabella, and his growing anger at a system that seemed to sacrifice human happiness for political stability. He watched other royal couples from neighboring kingdoms and wondered how many of them were also living elaborate lies for the sake of their nations. As the rain continued to fall against the palace windows, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He could not continue to live with this knowledge in isolation. Someone needed to know the truth, and someone needed to help find a solution that could preserve both the kingdom's stability and his family's emotional well-being. The question was who he could trust with such a dangerous secret, and whether any solution existed that wouldn't destroy everything his family had worked to build. The crown that awaited him suddenly felt less like an honor and more like a burden that might crush him under its weight. Alexander's decision to confide in someone led him to an unexpected choice. Rather than approaching a trusted advisor or family member, he found himself seeking out Sir Thomas Hartwell, the palace's head librarian and historian. Thomas had served the royal family for over 30 years and had a reputation for absolute discretion. More importantly, he had been present during the negotiations that led to King Edmund's marriage to Isabella, and Alexander suspected he might already know more than he let on. The library at Rosewood Palace was a sanctuary filled with centuries of royal history, its walls lined with leather-bound chronicles that documented the triumphs and tragedies of Alexander's ancestors. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of past monarchs, that Alexander finally broke his silence about what he had discovered. Sir Thomas listened without interruption as Alexander recounted the overheard conversation between his parents. The older man's face remained carefully neutral, but Alexander caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. When the prince finished speaking, Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the ancient oak desk between them. "Your Highness," Thomas finally said, his voice heavy with years of accumulated secrets, "what you have discovered is indeed true. I have been waiting for this conversation for over a decade." He rose from his chair and moved to a locked cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder marked with the royal seal. "Perhaps it is time you learned the full story of your father's sacrifice." The documents Thomas shared painted an even more complex picture than Alexander had imagined. The marriage arrangement between King Edmund and Isabella had been negotiated during one of the darkest periods in both kingdoms' histories. Valdoria was on the brink of civil war, and Rosewood was facing economic collapse due to trade disputes and failed harvests. The marriage was not just a diplomatic convenience but a desperate measure to prevent catastrophe for millions of people. King Edmund had been genuinely grieving the loss of Alexander's mother when the marriage proposal was presented. He had initially refused, but the pressure from his advisors and the growing crisis had eventually worn down his resistance. Isabella, for her part, had volunteered for the marriage knowing full well that Edmund's heart belonged to his deceased wife. She saw it as her patriotic duty to save her homeland, even at the cost of her own happiness. The folder contained letters between Edmund and Isabella during their courtship, documents that revealed their mutual respect but also their honest acknowledgement that love was not part of their arrangement. They had both hoped that affection might grow over time, but the shadow of Alexander's mother had proved too long for Edmund to step out of, and Isabella had gradually accepted that she would never be more than a respected partner in ruling. What struck Alexander most powerfully was discovering that both his father and stepmother had made their sacrifice knowingly and willingly. They had spent years maintaining their public facade not out of deception, but out of genuine care for their subjects' welfare. The peace treaty they embodied had indeed prevented war, stabilized trade, and brought prosperity to both kingdoms. Their personal unhappiness was a price they had consciously chosen to pay. Thomas revealed that he had been keeping detailed records of the arrangement, not for any malicious purpose, but because he believed history needed an honest accounting of the true costs of leadership. The documents showed how Edmund and Isabella had developed a deep friendship and mutual respect over the years, even without romantic love. They had become genuine partners in governance, even if they remained strangers in their private lives. The revelation that his parents' marriage was a conscious sacrifice rather than a cruel trap changed Alexander's perspective dramatically. His anger began to transform into something more complex: admiration mixed with sadness, respect combined with determination to find a better solution for his own generation. But the weight of knowledge continued to grow heavier when Thomas shared additional information. King Edmund's health had been declining more rapidly than the public knew. The stress of maintaining his emotional facade while carrying the enormous responsibilities of kingship was taking its toll. Palace physicians had privately warned that the king might have only a few more years of active rule left in him. This news meant that Alexander's coronation was likely much closer than anyone publicly acknowledged. The prospect of becoming king while his father was still alive but too ill to rule effectively created another layer of complexity. Would Alexander inherit not just the crown, but also the burden of maintaining his parents' public deception? Isabella's situation was equally tragic in its own way. At 43, she was still young enough to find love and happiness, but her position as queen made that impossible. She had devoted herself so completely to royal duty that she had sacrificed any chance of personal fulfillment. Thomas showed Alexander letters from Valdorian nobles suggesting that Isabella was deeply depressed, though she hid it well behind her public service and charitable work. The conversation with Thomas lasted deep into the night, with Alexander learning details about royal life that no amount of preparation for kingship had taught him. He discovered that many royal marriages throughout history had been arrangements like his parents', and that the fairy tale romances the public believed in were often carefully constructed myths designed to provide hope and stability to ordinary citizens. But Thomas also shared stories of monarchs who had found ways to balance duty with personal happiness, kings and queens who had managed to serve their people while also honoring their own emotional needs. These examples gave Alexander hope that perhaps a different path was possible, but they also showed how rare and difficult such solutions were to achieve. As the clock struck midnight in the palace library, Alexander found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own future, but potentially the fate of two kingdoms. He could accept the traditional path of duty-bound marriage and personal sacrifice, following his parents' example of putting the greater good above individual happiness. Or he could attempt to forge a new way of being royal, one that honored both his obligations to his people and his right to personal fulfillment. The weight of this decision was complicated by his relationship with Lady Margaret. Their courtship had been progressing along traditional royal lines, with both families expecting an engagement announcement soon. But now Alexander found himself questioning everything about their relationship. Was what he felt for her genuine love, or simply the comfort of following an expected path? Would marrying her doom them both to repeat his parents' tragic arrangement? Thomas offered one final piece of counsel before they parted that night. He reminded Alexander that the power to change traditions lay in the hands of those who inherited them. While past monarchs had been trapped by circumstances and limited options, Alexander would have opportunities his predecessors never had. The world was changing, and perhaps the monarchy could change with it. But any change would come with enormous risks. Breaking with tradition could destabilize the carefully balanced relationships between kingdoms. Alexander's choices would affect not just his own happiness, but the peace and prosperity that his parents' sacrifice had bought for their people. As Alexander returned to his chambers that night, his mind was spinning with possibilities and dangers. The secret he had been carrying alone was now shared, but the burden of decision was entirely his. In just a few hours, he would have to face his parents again, knowing everything he now knew about their sacrifice, their pain, and their hopes for his future. The young prince stood at the crossroads between tradition and change, duty and desire, his parents' path and his own. Whatever he chose would echo through generations, shaping not just his own destiny but the future of the monarchy itself. The morning after his revelation in the library, Alexander knew he could no longer pretend ignorance about his parents' situation. The breakfast that had been scheduled as a routine family meeting suddenly felt like walking into a battlefield where the weapons were unspoken truths and carefully maintained lies. King Edmund appeared more tired than usual, the lines around his eyes deeper in the morning light streaming through the dining room windows. Queen Isabella maintained her usual composed demeanor, but Alexander now noticed the subtle signs of strain that had been invisible to him before: the way she held her shoulders too straight, the careful distance she maintained from his father even in private moments. Princess Catherine was also present, chattering excitedly about her wedding preparations. Her enthusiasm for marriage, built on her admiration for what she believed was their parents' loving relationship, made Alexander's stomach clench with anxiety. His sister's innocent happiness felt like a timer counting down to inevitable heartbreak. The family discussion began routinely enough, with updates on state affairs and upcoming royal obligations. But, when King Edmund mentioned the need for Alexander to begin considering marriage more seriously, the prince felt something snap inside him. The careful control he had maintained for weeks finally broke. "Father," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the polite conversation like a blade, "I need to speak with you and Isabella privately. There's something we must discuss immediately." The change in atmosphere was instant. Princess Catherine looked confused by her brother's sudden intensity, while King Edmund and Queen Isabella exchanged a glance that confirmed Alexander's suspicions about their awareness of their secret's fragility. After Catherine was dismissed with a gentle excuse about reviewing wedding preparations, the three remaining family members faced each other across the breakfast table in heavy silence. Alexander struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between what they all knew and what none of them had ever acknowledged. "I know," Alexander finally said simply. "I know about your marriage. I know about the arrangement, the sacrifice, everything." The effect of his words was immediate and devastating. King Edmund's face went pale, while Isabella's carefully composed expression crumbled for just a moment before she regained control. The silence that followed felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only seconds. "How long have you known?" King Edmund asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of hidden pain. Alexander recounted the overheard argument and his subsequent conversation with Sir Thomas. As he spoke, he watched his parents' faces transform from shock to resignation to something that might have been relief. When he finished, Isabella was the first to speak. "I'm sorry you had to learn this way," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We never wanted to burden you with our choices." "But they're not just your choices anymore," Alexander replied, his voice stronger now that the secret was out in the open. "I'm going to be king soon, and I can't build my reign on the same foundation of sacrifice and hidden misery." What followed was the most honest conversation the three of them had ever shared. King Edmund spoke about the impossible position he had been placed in after Alexander's mother died, how the needs of the kingdom had demanded that he remarry before he was emotionally ready to love again. He revealed how guilty he felt about Isabella's sacrifice, how watching her dedicate herself to royal duty while receiving so little in return had become a source of constant regret. Isabella, in turn, shared her own perspective with a candor that surprised both men. She spoke about her initial hopes that love might grow between them, her gradual acceptance that it wouldn't, and her decision to find meaning through service to their people rather than through personal relationships. But she also revealed something that stunned both father and son: she had fallen in love with someone else. Lord Michael Ashford, the kingdom's master of arts and culture, had been working closely with Isabella on various cultural initiatives for 3 years. Their professional relationship had gradually deepened into something more, though Isabella had never acted on her feelings due to her royal obligations. The admission hung in the air like a confession of treason, even though no actual impropriety had occurred. King Edmund's reaction was not anger but profound sadness, not because his wife loved another man, but because his own inability to love her had driven her to such loneliness that she had been forced to seek emotional connection elsewhere. The conversation that followed revealed years of mutual guilt, respect, and genuine care between two people trapped in impossible circumstances. Alexander found himself becoming the mediator in a conversation that should have happened years earlier. He watched his parents finally acknowledge truths they had both known but never spoken, finally expressing regrets and understanding that had been buried under royal protocol and public expectations. But the conversation also revealed new complications. Princess Catherine's wedding was just months away, and her marriage had been arranged partly because of the success her parents appeared to have achieved. The duke she was engaged to marry genuinely loved her, but their family's alliance was built on the model of Edmund and Isabella's supposed happiness. More critically, the peace treaty with Valdoria contained specific clauses about the royal marriage that had never been formally amended. If King Edmund and Queen Isabella were to separate or divorce, it could technically void critical aspects of the trade and defense agreements that protected both kingdoms. The discussion turned to Alexander's own future and his relationship with Lady Margaret. Under the intense honesty of the moment, Alexander admitted that he had been questioning whether his feelings for her were genuine or simply the result of following expected patterns. The possibility that he might be repeating his parents' mistake terrified him. King Edmund looked at his son with an expression of profound concern mixed with hope. "You have an opportunity that I never had," he said quietly. "You have time to choose carefully, and you have knowledge of the costs of choosing wrongly. Use both wisely." Isabella added her own counsel, speaking from her years of experience living with the consequences of duty-bound marriage. "Don't sacrifice your happiness for the crown unless you're certain the sacrifice is necessary," she said. "And if you do sacrifice, make sure you're choosing it freely, not just following tradition because it's easier than finding a better way." But, even as they spoke about Alexander's future, the immediate question of what to do about the current situation remained unanswered. King Edmund's health was indeed declining, making any major changes in royal arrangements potentially dangerous for the stability of the kingdom. Isabella's position was secure as long as she maintained her role, but any attempt to seek personal happiness could be seen as abandoning her duties. The conversation lasted well into the afternoon, covering years of suppressed emotions and hidden truths. By the end, all three felt emotionally exhausted but also strangely liberated. The lies that had defined their family dynamics for over a decade were finally exposed, allowing them to interact with honesty for the first time. But honesty, they discovered, brought its own burdens. Now that they all acknowledged the problems, they felt obligated to find solutions. The question was whether any solutions existed that wouldn't create even greater problems for their people and their kingdom. As the day ended, Alexander realized that his confrontation had solved nothing and everything simultaneously. The secret was out, the truth was acknowledged, and the family relationships were more honest than they had ever been. But the fundamental problems remained: a king trapped in a loveless marriage that was essential to his kingdom's stability, a queen sacrificing her happiness for duty, and a crown prince who now had to choose between following their path or risking everything to forge a new one. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, but, for the first time, Alexander felt like he might have the strength to carry it differently than his predecessors had. The question was whether the kingdom could survive the changes such a different approach would require. 6 months later, the kingdom of Rosewood was preparing for changes that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The journey from Alexander's discovery of his parents' secret to the radical transformation of royal tradition had been filled with difficult conversations, careful negotiations, and moments when the very stability of the kingdom seemed to hang in the balance. The first major breakthrough had come when Alexander proposed bringing Princess Catherine into their circle of honesty. Initially, both King Edmund and Queen Isabella had resisted, wanting to protect her happiness as she approached her wedding. But Alexander argued that building Catherine's marriage on the illusion of their parents' happiness was unfair to both her and her future husband. The conversation with Catherine had been every bit as difficult as Alexander had expected, but her reaction surprised everyone. Rather than devastation, she expressed relief that the nagging doubts she had felt about marriage were justified. She had sensed something hollow about her parents' relationship but had convinced herself she was imagining things. Learning the truth allowed her to approach her own marriage with realistic expectations and honest communication with her fiancé. Duke Richard of Cornwall proved to be unexpectedly understanding when Catherine shared her family's story with him. Rather than backing away from the engagement, he expressed admiration for her parents' sacrifice and suggested that he and Catherine use their marriage as an opportunity to prove that royal unions could be both politically beneficial and personally fulfilling. Their wedding became a symbol of a new generation's approach to balancing duty with personal happiness. But the real transformation began when Alexander made an unprecedented decision about his own future. After months of soul-searching and careful consideration, he chose to break his informal engagement with Lady Margaret Thornfield. The decision was not made lightly or cruelly. Alexander was honest with Margaret about his doubts and his determination not to repeat his parents' mistake. Lady Margaret's response revealed her own wisdom and strength. She admitted that she too had felt their relationship lacked the passionate foundation necessary for a lifetime of marriage and royal duty. They parted as friends, with Margaret expressing gratitude for Alexander's honesty and courage in refusing to settle for a convenient but hollow arrangement. The more radical change came when Alexander announced his intention to court Lady Elena Fairmont, the daughter of a respected but not particularly powerful noble family. Elena was intelligent, compassionate, and shared Alexander's vision for a more progressive monarchy, but she was not the strategic marriage choice that royal advisors would have recommended. The announcement sent shockwaves through the court and neighboring kingdoms, but Alexander handled the political consequences with careful diplomacy and clear communication about his intentions. He spent months meeting with foreign dignitaries and domestic leaders, explaining that his choice of bride was based on creating a strong partnership for effective rule rather than simply following traditional alliance patterns. Meanwhile, King Edmund and Queen Isabella were quietly working with their advisors to address the implications of their own situation. The solution they developed was both innovative and respectful of everyone involved. Rather than seeking divorce, which would have created massive political complications, they chose to transform their marriage into an openly acknowledged partnership of friendship and mutual respect. The arrangement they negotiated allowed both of them to find personal fulfillment while maintaining their official roles. Queen Isabella was granted unprecedented autonomy to pursue her own interests and relationships, while King Edmund was freed from the emotional burden of pretending to be a loving husband. Most importantly, they worked together to renegotiate aspects of the Valdorian Treaty that had tied their personal relationship too closely to international agreements. The public announcement of these changes was handled with remarkable skill and honesty. Rather than pretending the royal family was perfect, they chose to present themselves as people who had learned from their mistakes and were committed to serving their people while also honoring their personal needs and growth. Queen Isabella's relationship with Lord Michael Ashford was acknowledged publicly, though they chose not to marry in order to preserve Isabella's royal status and the stability it provided. Their partnership became an example of how love could exist within the constraints of royal duty without requiring the destruction of those constraints. King Edmund, freed from the guilt and stress of his failed marriage, experienced a remarkable improvement in both his health and his effectiveness as a ruler. The energy he had been spending on maintaining emotional facades was redirected into governance and personal healing. He began working closely with historians to document the true costs and benefits of various royal marriage arrangements, hoping to provide future generations with better information for their own choices. Alexander's relationship with Lady Elena flourished under the new atmosphere of honesty and choice rather than obligation. Their courtship became a model for how royal relationships could be built on genuine compatibility and shared vision rather than political convenience alone. When they announced their engagement after a year of courtship, it was clear to everyone that their partnership was based on love and mutual respect. The transformation of the royal family had broader implications for the kingdom as well. The example of honest communication and the courage to challenge tradition inspired changes in court culture and even influenced how ordinary citizens approached their own family relationships and life choices. Sir Thomas Hartwell played a crucial role throughout the transition, using his historical knowledge to help the family understand how other monarchies had successfully navigated similar changes. His documentation of the entire process created a valuable record for future royal families facing similar dilemmas. The changes were not without their challenges and critics. Some traditional nobles expressed concern about the precedent being set, worrying that abandoning arranged marriages would weaken political alliances. Foreign courts watched carefully to see whether Rosewood's new approach would create instability or whether it might be a model worth emulating. But the results spoke for themselves. The kingdom remained stable, the economy continued to grow, and international relationships were maintained through the new framework of honest diplomacy rather than personal sacrifice. The peace with Valdoria was actually strengthened when the artificial pressure on the royal marriage was removed and replaced with more sustainable political and economic agreements. Perhaps most importantly, the royal family became a source of inspiration rather than a facade to be maintained. Their willingness to acknowledge their humanity and work through their problems openly created a new kind of respect and affection from their subjects. As Alexander prepared for his eventual coronation, he did so with the confidence that comes from having chosen his path consciously rather than simply inheriting it. His marriage to Elena was scheduled to take place in the spring, and their engagement had already become a symbol of hope for a new generation of leaders who could balance personal fulfillment with public service. King Edmund, now in his final years of active rule, expressed profound satisfaction with the changes his family had made. The legacy he would leave was not just a stable kingdom, but a transformed understanding of how royal duty could be fulfilled without requiring the complete sacrifice of personal happiness. Queen Isabella, thriving in her new arrangement, had become an even more effective advocate for the kingdom's cultural and charitable initiatives. Her relationship with Lord Michael had given her a joy and energy that enhanced rather than detracted from her royal duties. The story that had begun with a young prince accidentally discovering his parents' secret had evolved into a transformation that would influence royal families for generations to come. Alexander had learned that true strength sometimes came from challenging tradition rather than simply accepting it, and that the greatest service to his people might be showing them that it was possible to live with both integrity and happiness. As he stood once again at the palace windows, looking out over the kingdom he would soon rule, Alexander no longer felt burdened by the weight of the crown awaiting him. Instead, he felt the excitement of possibility, knowing that he had the knowledge, support, and love necessary to carry that crown in a way that honored both his duty to his people and his responsibility to himself. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds over Rosewood Palace, casting light on what felt like a new era of royal leadership built on truth, choice, and the courage to forge a better path forward.